everybody, welcome back to the Hear2See channel. Have an overview for you of the Bible book of 1 Corinthians. Hear2See, we focus on sharing pearls of wisdom, nuggets of knowledge, understanding the difficult, and instructions for a better life. 1 Corinthians. Hey, we're about to go through reading a chapter of Corinthians each day and doing a Hear Journal each day. But first, let's look at the overview of the book of 1 Corinthians. Chuck Swindoll's Insight for Living webpage has an overview on each book of the Bible, and he's got one for 1 Corinthians. As you can see here, and we're going to look at who wrote the book, where are we, why is it so important, what's the big idea, and how do I apply this? There's a Bible study aid as well. Okay, first, 1 Corinthians, who wrote the book? Paul's authorship on this epistle is widely accepted in the scholarly community, though it was not the first letter Paul wrote to the Corinthian people. We know that the Corinthians misunderstood an earlier letter from Paul in chapter 5, verse 10 and 11, though that letter has not survived. Therefore, it's Paul's second letter to the Corinthians that we know as 1 Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians that God inspired. 4 years prior to writing this letter, we know as 1 Corinthians, the apostle had spent 18 months in Corinth, so he was intimately familiar with the church and many of its congregants. The recipients of the letter must have understood the letter's significance not only to their own circumstances, but for the church worldwide. In AD 95, Clement, the Bishop of Rome, wrote a letter of his own to the Corinthians in which he invoked the authority of Paul's instruction in 1 Corinthians. Only a few decades after its origin, the letter to the Corinthians had traveled outside of Corinth and was considered authoritative beyond its initial Corinthian context. So now, where are we? Paul had been in Ephesus for more than 2 years on his third missionary journey when he received a disturbing report of quarreling within the Corinthian church, a report he received from people associated with one of its members, Chloe. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 11. The church he had founded so recently, reference Acts chapter 18, 1 through 17, had already developed deep divisions, a situation that required immediate action. Paul penned his letter in AD 55, just as he was planning to leave Ephesus for Macedonia, reference 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 5 through 8. So now, why is it so important? 1 Corinthians contains discussion of the church and issues that impacted real people in the first century. The Corinthian church was corroded with sin on a variety of fronts. So Paul provided an important model on how the church should handle the problem of sin in its midst. Rather than turn a blind eye towards relational division of all kinds of immorality, he addressed the problems head on. In this bold call to purity within the Corinthian church, Paul made it clear that he was willing to risk the good opinion of some in order to help cleanse the sin that tainted the church. Now, 1 Corinthians, what's the big idea? 1 Corinthians addresses reports that Paul received from Chloe's household, as well as a letter he received from the church itself, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. In this letter to the church at Corinth, Paul covered a number of different issues related to both life and doctrine, divisions and quarrels, sexual immorality, lawsuits among believers, marriage and singleness, freedom in Christ, order in worship, the significance of the Lord's Supper, and the right use of spiritual gifts. He also included a profound teaching on the resurrection. On the line of thought that joins these topics together was Paul's emphasis on Christian conduct in the local church. The apostle expected that Christian people would live according to Christian ideals, or as he told them, "You have been bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body." So how do I apply this? Corinth was a large international metropolis filled with people from different backgrounds. Idol worship to gods such as Aphrodite was particularly prominent in the city, though Corinth contained numerous temptations far beyond her temples. In this sense, Corinth was very much like a modern urban area, containing unending opportunities to engage in sinful behavior without any apparent consequences. Such a community clearly had a negative influence on the Corinthian church. But notice that Paul's instruction to the believers was not to retreat from their city. It was not Paul's vision for the church then or now. Instead, he directed us to live our commitment to Christ ever more faithfully in the midst of non-believers. Paul expected that we Christians would shine our light into the dark places of their world by worshiping in a unified community that was accountable to one another. He expected that we would settle our problems internally, that we would encourage one another in the pursuit of purity, and that we would strive together by holding tightly to the hope of our bodily resurrection to come. What can you do within your local church to make this kind of community more of a reality? So then, Dr. Swindoll's site provides us an overview Bible chart of 1 Corinthians. You can see this chart is very similar to the other charts that Dr. Swindoll has on each book of the Bible. And it's broken up on the left column. You can see introduction, key, need, theme, key verses, Christ in 1 Corinthians. And then going vertically, you can see we've got a column for reduce, for sinful conditions. That's sections. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 through chapter 4 and 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and 6. And then chapters 7 through 16, verse 9 is a reply to specific questions, and then is the conclusion. And those divisions are the division in the church, the disorder in the church, and the difficulty in the church. And of course, in Christ in 1 Corinthians, Jesus is the source of unity amongst believers who are baptized into his body and the basis of their ultimate resurrection and glorification. So you can go to Dr. Swindoll's site and check that out. The link is in the description below. Check out our other videos. We've got a Hear journal for each chapter of Proverbs, Acts, the Gospel of Mark, and now 1 Corinthians. You can read along with us one chapter a day and read my Hear journal for each of those chapters. Hope this was useful to you. This is our overview of 1 Corinthians. And again, we're going to be reading one chapter of 1 Corinthians each day and doing a Hear Journal of it. Like and subscribe, and you can follow along, and we're going to see you in chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians. Comment below, share your experiences. Have you been reading along with us? And read the Gospel of John chapter 3 to receive forgiveness, and talk to God about it. He loves you. He really, really does. Keep seeking Him. God bless.